A grizzled mountain man has lived alone for 3 decades, building a quiet life of sawdust, coffee, and old letters. One week, a warm volunteer shows up claiming she's there to be his wife for a week, not for romance, but for comfort, and everything the town thought it knew begins to unravel. Secrets spill from a half-finished cradle, an unsent love letter, and a rumor that won't die. Suddenly, his silence looks a lot like a promise, and someone's whole life might depend on the truth. In 7 days, they'll face gossip, a public accusation, and the choice between protecting a lie or risking everything for honesty. Who did he protect? And what will happen if the truth finally comes out? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning sun filtered through frost-dusted windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards of Eli Mercer's cabin. Outside, the wind whispered through towering pines, a sound as familiar to him as his own breathing. At 72 years old, Eli moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had turned routine into an art form, each motion measured and purposeful, like the ticking of an old clock that had kept perfect time for decades. He shuffled to his small kitchen, his slippered feet making soft scratching sounds against the wood. The cabin creaked around him, settling into the cold morning as if stretching awake. The coffee tin waited in its usual spot, 3rd shelf from the top, right side, exactly where it had sat every morning for the past 15 years. His hands, weathered but still steady, knuckles slightly swollen from arthritis that he refused to acknowledge, measured out the grounds with precision. 4 level scoops, no more and certainly no less. The old percolator had been with him for 20 years now, and its gentle burbling filled the silence of the cabin with a comforting rhythm that marked the beginning of each solitary day. While the coffee brewed, releasing its rich aroma into the chilly air, Eli pulled on his heavy coat, the wool one with patches at the elbows that he'd mended himself, and stepped outside. The morning air bit at his cheeks like tiny needles as he made his way to the woodpile, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated in the wind. Frost crunched beneath his boots, and the distant calls of winter birds echoed through the trees. He didn't need much, just enough for the day. That was his way, taking only what was necessary, nothing more. The rhythmic thunk of the axe splitting wood echoed across the clearing, a sound that had become part of the mountain itself. One log, then another, then a third. The satisfying crack as each piece separated perfectly along the grain. That would do. Back inside, coffee in hand, black, no sugar, in the blue enamel mug with the chip on the rim, Eli's eyes drifted to the workbench by the window. Morning light spilled across his tools, each hanging in its designated place on the pegboard above. A half-finished piece sat beneath an old cloth, waiting patiently for his attention. He pulled the fabric back, revealing the smooth curves of what would become a rocking chair, its arms already taking shape under his careful craftsmanship. His calloused fingers traced the grain of the wood, feeling for imperfections that no one else would notice, but that would keep him awake at night, knowing they existed. The work gave his days purpose, even if no one ever saw the finished pieces, these silent witnesses to his solitude. There was a drawer in the corner of the room, its brass handle tarnished with age. He knew exactly what was in it. Letters bound with a faded blue ribbon, Lila's handwriting filling pages he hadn't read in years. But he refused to look that way. His jaw tightened involuntarily. Some memories were better left undisturbed, like sleeping bears in winter. At noon, he ate his lunch, a simple sandwich, ham and cheese on homemade bread, and an apple from last fall's harvest, slightly wrinkled but still sweet. The routine never varied. The ticking of the old wall clock kept him company as he chewed methodically, staring out at the mountains that had become his only neighbors. After washing his plate in water he'd heated on the stove, he grabbed his coat again and headed out to check the rabbit traps, pulling his worn cap down over his ears against the increasing chill. The sky above had changed since morning. Dark clouds were gathering over the mountain peaks like a brooding presence, and the wind carried the sharp scent of approaching snow, metallic and clean. The trees swayed ominously, their branches clacking together in warning. The traps were empty today, the wire cages undisturbed in their hiding spots among the underbrush. Eli didn't mind. He had enough stored away, canned goods and dried meat to last through any storm. As he walked back, the first few snowflakes began to fall, delicate and hesitant at first, then more insistent. They caught in his gray beard and melted against the warmth of his skin. The temperature was dropping fast. It would be a rough night. He could feel it in his bones, the old injury in his left knee throbbing with the coming pressure change. Evening came early in the mountains, daylight surrendering quickly to the approaching storm. Eli warmed up the leftover stew from yesterday, stirring the thick broth and chunks of venison in his cast-iron pot, the aroma filling the small cabin with comforting warmth. He ate at his small table while watching the storm build outside his window, spooning the food slowly as darkness crept closer. The wind had picked up, making the old cabin creak and groan like a ship at sea, timbers protesting against the gathering fury. After washing up, wiping each dish dry with meticulous care, he settled into his favorite chair, the one with the cushion that bore the perfect imprint of his body after years of use. The oil lamp sat on the table beside him, unlit while the last of the daylight faded. When darkness finally filled the cabin, wrapping around him like a familiar blanket, Eli reached for the matches. The lamp's wick caught immediately, spreading a warm golden glow through the room, pushing back the shadows into the corners. And that's when he heard it, a knock at the door. Eli's hand froze mid-motion, still holding the burnt match, the smell of sulfur sharp in his nostrils. Nobody came up here uninvited. Nobody had knocked on his door in years, not since he'd made it clear he preferred his solitude to company. The sound came again, more insistent this time, 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo through every corner of his sanctuary. His heart hammered in his chest, the sudden rush of adrenaline feeling foreign after years of measured calm. For a moment, he considered pretending he wasn't home, sitting motionless until whoever it was went away. But the light from his lamp would be visible through the windows, a golden beacon in the gathering storm. Besides, with the storm coming in strong, whoever was out there might need help, and despite everything, Eli couldn't ignore someone in danger. The knock echoed through the cabin a 3rd time, more desperate now, competing with the howling of the wind. Eli remained motionless in his chair, his mind racing through possibilities like leaves scattered by the gale outside. Park rangers wouldn't come this late, not in this weather. His few supplies were delivered on a strict monthly schedule, and this wasn't the day. He kept track of time with military precision. The last unexpected visitor he'd had was 5 years ago, a lost hiker who'd strayed too far from the marked trails, a young man with a city accent and inadequate gear who'd been pathetically grateful for Eli's gruff assistance. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames, and Eli could hear the heavy patter of sleet beginning to fall, tapping against the glass like impatient fingers. Whoever was out there had picked a dangerous night to wander the mountain, and regardless of his preference for isolation, he couldn't leave someone to the mercy of the elements. With a deep breath and a grumble, Eli pulled open the heavy wooden door. Wind and sleet whipped inside with a vengeance, stinging his face and sending a chill through the cabin. There, standing on his porch, was a woman, water cascading from her bright yellow raincoat and forming puddles at her sensible boots. "Hello there," she called out cheerfully, as if she were greeting him at a summer picnic rather than standing in the middle of a raging mountain storm. "I'm Maggie Harper. You must be Eli Mercer." Eli stared at her, dumbfounded. Nobody came up his mountain drive, especially not during weather like this. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, with graying hair tucked under a rain-soaked knitted hat, and bright, intelligent eyes that crinkled deeply at the corners when she smiled. Despite the weather, there was something undeniably warm about her presence that seemed to push against the cold air rushing into his cabin. "I'm your assigned volunteer for the Wife for a Week program," she continued, seemingly unfazed by his silence and the water dripping from her hat onto her nose. "It's a hospice service where we provide companionship and practical assistance to folks who—" "Hospice?" Eli's voice came out rough from disuse, the word scraping against his throat. He hadn't spoken to another human being in nearly 2 weeks. "Lady, I think you've got the wrong cabin. I'm not dying." Maggie consulted a small, leather-bound notebook she pulled from her pocket, carefully shielding it from the rain with cupped hands. Her fingers were slender but strong-looking, the nails practical and short. "Ruth Johnson, the town nurse, put you on our list herself just this morning. She said you qualified for the program and was quite specific about the address." Thunder crashed overhead with a deafening boom that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin, making the porch lights flicker ominously. Eli looked past Maggie at the sheets of rain now mixing with sleet, the mountain path already turning into a dangerous mudslide. His jaw clenched as he wrestled with his conscience, his instinct for solitude battling with basic human decency. "Better come in," he muttered finally, stepping aside and holding the door wider. "At least until the storm passes." The words felt foreign in his mouth, an invitation he hadn't extended to anyone in years. "Thank you!" Maggie hurried inside with surprising quickness for her age, bringing with her the earthy smell of rain and something sweet. Cinnamon, maybe, or nutmeg. She removed her dripping coat with practiced efficiency, water pooling on his worn wooden floor, and Eli pointed wordlessly to the hook near the fireplace, where his own jacket hung in solitary abandonment. "I brought pie," she announced with obvious pride, producing a covered glass dish from her large canvas bag. "Apple? Made it fresh this morning when Ruth told me about the assignment. Nothing beats homemade pie on a day like this, don't you think?" Eli watched as she made herself at home, setting the pie on his kitchen counter and unwrapping it with practiced movements, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who had prepared and shared food thousands of times. The golden crust gleamed in the dim cabin light, steam still rising gently from the carefully cut vents. "Ms. Harper, Maggie, please." She smiled at him over her shoulder, already opening his drawers as if she had every right to do so, searching for utensils. "Ms. Harper," he continued firmly, planting his feet wider as if bracing himself against her casual invasion. "I don't need a volunteer, I don't need hospice, and I certainly don't need a wife for a week." He practically spat out the words, the very concept offensive to his deeply private nature. She turned to face him fully now, her expression kind but determined, the spatula she'd found held like a scepter. "Ruth seemed to think otherwise, and since I'm already here and that storm isn't letting up—" She glanced out the window where lightning illuminated the torrential downpour, casting brief, ghostly shadows across the cabin walls. "Maybe we could just talk? Sometimes that's all the medicine a person needs." Eli remained standing by the door, his posture stiff as a pine board. His hands hung awkwardly at his sides, unsure what to do with them now that a stranger occupied his space. "There's nothing to talk about. This is all some kind of mistake." His voice sounded harsh even to his own ears. "Well, mistake or not, I'm afraid my car's stuck in the mud about 50 yards down your drive," Maggie said, her tone apologetic but not particularly worried, as if getting stranded on a mountain in a storm was just another Tuesday adventure. "The roads were already washing out when I came up. I nearly turned back twice, but Ruth was so insistent that you needed someone today." As if to emphasize her point, another crack of thunder shook the cabin, rattling the dishes in his cupboard and making the old floorboards creak in protest. Eli ran a weathered hand over his face, feeling the scratch of stubble against his palm and the weight of exhaustion in his bones. He felt trapped in his own home, cornered by this cheerful intruder and the raging elements conspiring against him. Maggie busied herself cutting 2 generous slices of pie and placing them on the only clean plates she could find among his sparse kitchenware. The domestic normalcy of the action felt alien in Eli's carefully maintained solitude, like a splash of bright paint on a gray canvas. The sweet, spicy aroma of the pie began to fill the small space, battling with the musty smell of a cabin too long closed up against the outside world. "I'll take the couch for tonight, if you don't mind," she said matter-of-factly, setting the plates on his small table with a gentle click. "I promise I'm an excellent houseguest. You'll hardly know I'm here. I don't snore, at least no one's ever complained, and I'm perfectly content with my book and a blanket." Eli doubted that very much, studying her animated face and restless energy. He couldn't bring himself to force her back out into the storm, though the thought briefly tempted him. He watched as she settled onto his couch, the springs creaking slightly under her weight, pulling out a dog-eared paperback from her seemingly bottomless bag, as if she'd been planning to stay all along. The wind howled outside like a wounded animal, rattling the windows in their frames. And inside, the silence stretched between them, thick and awkward. It was broken only by the occasional turn of a page, the steady ticking of his old wall clock, and the persistent drip of water from her coat near the fireplace. Eli remained standing, rigid and uncertain, his slice of pie untouched and cooling on the table, as the reality of his disrupted solitude sank in like a stone. Something about Ruth's involvement in this situation nagged at him, like a splinter under skin. Ruth knew he valued his privacy, above all else. But for now, he was stuck with an unwanted guest and a mystery he wasn't sure he wanted to solve, trapped in his own sanctuary that suddenly felt foreign with another person breathing his air. Dawn crept over the mountain, filtering through the cabin's windows in soft, golden streaks that illuminated dancing dust motes. Eli stirred on his bed, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar sounds of movement in his kitchen. The gentle clink of dishes, the sweep of bristles against wood. The events of last night's storm rushed back as the rich, inviting aroma of fresh coffee reached him, snaking under his door like an unwelcome invitation to socialize. Pulling on his worn flannel shirt, the fabric soft from years of washing, he shuffled into the main room and found Maggie already dressed and bustling around his kitchen with an energy that made his joints ache just watching. She'd somehow located his ancient broom, probably from the forgotten closet he rarely opened, and was sweeping decades of accumulated dust from corners he'd long ago decided to ignore. Little piles of evidence of his solitary existence formed around the room. "Good morning," she called out cheerfully, her voice bright as the morning sunshine streaming through the windows. "Hope you don't mind, but I found your coffee supplies. Pot's almost ready. The grounds were a bit stale, but still serviceable." Eli grunted, his morning face set in deep lines, thrown off balance by this unexpected invasion of his sacred morning routine. "Didn't ask for housekeeping services," he muttered, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "Oh, I know," Maggie replied, completely unfazed by his gruffness, her smile never faltering. "But since I'm here, might as well make myself useful. Can't just sit around admiring the view, though it is spectacular. What's your usual morning routine?" "My routine is being alone," Eli said pointedly, reaching past her to pour himself a cup of coffee that smelled better than anything he'd made in years. "Been that way for 20 years. Works just fine." He took a sip, surprised at how good it tasted, though he'd never admit it. Maggie paused her sweeping, leaning slightly on the broom handle, studying him with gentle eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed walls. "Must get lonely up here sometimes," she observed, her voice softening. "That's the point." He took his steaming coffee mug to the porch, the screen door creaking familiarly behind him, hoping she'd take the hint and give him some peace with the morning bird song and distant wind in the pines. Instead, she followed him out moments later, wrapping a colorful knitted shawl around her shoulders against the mountain morning chill. "Roads are still pretty muddy from last night's storm. I checked while you were sleeping. Looks like I'm here for at least today." She brightened suddenly, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "Say, why don't I help with your chores? Make myself earn my keep? Seems only fair since you're stuck with me." Before Eli could object or explain that he preferred his tasks done his way, she'd spotted his well-worn axe leaning against the woodpile at the side of the cabin. "Need more firewood split? I'm stronger than I look, you know. Taught high school for 30 years. Builds unexpected muscles." 20 minutes later, Eli found himself reluctantly teaching Maggie proper axe technique, his calloused hands demonstrating the correct grip as she watched with earnest attention. She was determined and enthusiastic, if not particularly skilled, her first few swings landing awkwardly. "So," she said between slightly labored swings, wisps of silver-streaked hair escaping her practical ponytail, "lived here long?" The axe glanced off the side of the log, barely making a dent. "Yep." Eli stepped forward, adjusting her grip with careful hands. "Angle's wrong. More like this," he demonstrated with patient movements that surprised even himself. "Let the weight of the axe do the work." "Must be peaceful," she observed, concentrating on his instructions. She tried again, managing to split the wood this time with a satisfying crack. Her face lit up with accomplishment. "Though I'd miss having neighbors. Do you ever go into town?" "Don't." Eli handed her another log, stepping back to watch her technique improve with each swing. Their conversation continued in this halting pattern through the morning's work. Maggie would probe with gentle questions, Eli would deflect with one-word answers, but somehow they fell into a workable rhythm that felt less intrusive than he'd expected. The woodpile grew steadily as the sun climbed higher in the clear blue sky. By afternoon, with the outside chores completed, Maggie had moved inside to help organize his cluttered shelves, arranging canned goods by type and dusting ancient knickknacks he'd forgotten he owned. Eli was fixing a loose floorboard that had bothered him for months when he heard a drawer slide open from across the room. His head snapped up to see Maggie holding a faded photograph she'd found tucked beneath some papers. "Don't!" He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs, slamming the drawer shut with enough force to rattle nearby dishes. The photograph disappeared into his pocket before she could get a proper look at the smiling faces it contained, faces that still haunted his dreams. "I'm sorry," Maggie said softly, genuine regret in her eyes. "I shouldn't have pried. That was thoughtless of me." Eli's weathered hands were shaking slightly as he returned to the floorboard, focusing intently on the nails, as if they held the secrets of the universe, willing his pulse to slow and the memories to retreat back to their carefully locked compartments. That evening, over steaming bowls of simple vegetable stew Maggie had somehow conjured from his meager pantry supplies, and a few herbs she'd discovered growing wild outside, she tried again. That photograph seemed special, she ventured carefully, blowing on a spoonful of the fragrant broth. Not up for discussion. Eli's spoon clattered against his bowl with finality, the sound sharp in the quiet cabin. Sometimes talking about... No. His voice was final, low and firm, brooking no argument. The single syllable seemed to hang in the air between them. Maggie fell silent, but her eyes held understanding rather than hurt, a compassion that made him more uncomfortable than anger would have. They finished their meal without speaking, only the sounds of spoons against bowls and the occasional crack from the fireplace filling the room. As she prepared the couch for another night, smoothing the blankets with practiced hands, Maggie paused by the window, looking around the cabin's shadowy interior bathed in the warm glow of the kerosene lamp. "You know," she said thoughtfully, her voice gentle in the evening quiet, "this place feels like a treasure chest of memories. Every corner seems to hold stories. But sometimes I wonder if you're not so much protecting them as hiding from them." Eli didn't respond, his face a mask of practiced indifference as he retreated to his bedroom without a word, closing the door firmly behind him. But sleep proved elusive as he lay in the darkness, her words echoing in his mind like persistent whispers. The photograph seemed to burn in his pocket, and the drawer that held those blue-ribboned letters felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest, demanding acknowledgement. He stared at the water-stained ceiling, troubled by how easily this stranger, with her kind eyes and persistent questions, had seen through the walls he'd spent decades building around his heart and his history. The next morning's sunlight streamed through dusty windows as Maggie moved quietly through the cabin. The golden rays illuminated dancing dust motes in the air, casting warm patterns across the worn floorboards. Eli had gone out to check his traps at dawn, mumbling something about rabbit tracks in the fresh snow, giving her a chance to tackle the cluttered study she'd spotted yesterday. Armed with her duster and a determined spirit, she navigated carefully around precarious stacks of yellowed newspapers and leather-bound books that smelled of time and memory. The study felt like stepping into Eli's mind, organized chaos with hints of a methodical past. Faded photographs in simple frames lined one wall, their subjects difficult to make out beneath years of dust. A workbench in the corner held abandoned woodworking projects, tools arranged with the precision of a man who once took pride in his craft. A leather-bound journal lay open on the oak desk, its pages yellow with age and crinkled with what might have been teardrops long dried. As Maggie gently shifted it to dust underneath, careful not to disturb what felt like sacred space, a single sheet of paper slipped free, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. Her eyes caught the date scrawled in faded blue ink, June 15th, 1973, and the name at the top written in a strong, confident hand that must have belonged to a younger Eli. "Dearest Lila." Her fingers trembled slightly as she read the first few lines, knowing she was trespassing but unable to stop herself. "I promised you I would keep it safe, and I have. But the silence is killing me slower than any disease could. Sometimes at night, I think I hear... What are you doing?" Eli's voice, sharp as broken glass and cold as the mountain air, made her jump and nearly drop the letter. He stood rigid in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light from the hall, face pale with anger and something deeper that made Maggie's heart ache. Raw, unmasked fear etched in every line of his weathered face. "I'm so sorry," Maggie stammered, carefully setting down the letter where she'd found it. "I was just dusting, and it fell out. I shouldn't have read it." Her hands fluttered nervously like captured birds. "Get out." His words were quiet but fierce, each syllable carved from ice. "You had no right at all to dig through my things." Eli, I truly didn't mean to pry. No! He slammed his hand against the wooden doorframe with enough force to make the walls shudder, then seemed to deflate before her eyes, as though the brief explosion had drained something vital from him. Sinking heavily into his desk chair, he covered his face with weathered hands that had built and broken and held tight to secrets for decades. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion that had waited far too long to surface. Everyone thinks I'm dying because I wouldn't take the treatment. He laughed bitterly, the sound like dried leaves scraping across concrete. 20 years ago, after I lost her, they found something in my lungs. Nothing serious then, but it needed attention. I said no. Didn't see the point anymore. Maggie stood very still in the dust-filled sunlight, hardly daring to breathe, afraid any movement might break the fragile moment of truth unfolding before her. Town doctor told folks I was preparing for the end. Guess that story was easier than explaining the truth. Eli looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. Truth is, I just couldn't bear another hospital. Not after... He gestured helplessly at the letter, the small movement encompassing decades of grief. She was everything. When she died, part of me went with her. The best part. Oh, Eli. Maggie's voice was soft with compassion, not pity, a distinction she hoped he could hear. He straightened in his chair, squaring his shoulders like a soldier preparing for battle. Don't need pity. Just need people to leave me be. Been working fine for 40 years. Is that what you really need? Maggie asked gently, taking a cautious step toward him. Or just what you're used to? There's a difference, you know. Eli stared at her, momentarily startled by the quiet challenge in her question, as though no one had dared question his isolation in decades. I have a confession too, she continued, brushing dust from her hands onto her jeans. I should have left yesterday when the roads cleared. The highway's been open since noon, but something told me to stay. She met his gaze steadily, her eyes soft but unwavering. Let me stay the week, Eli. Not because you're dying, but because maybe it's time to start living again, whatever that looks like for you. Before he could respond, a cheerful knock echoed through the cabin like a woodpecker announcing spring. Sammy's young, eager face appeared in the study doorway, arms overflowing with paper grocery bags, his cheeks flushed from the cold mountain air. Morning, Mr. Mercer. Miss Harper still here? Roads are clear but still slippery in the shady spots. Brought extra supplies, figured you might need... He stopped mid-sentence, his enthusiasm faltering as he read the electric tension in the room. Sorry, is this a bad time? Just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed for, these days. His voice trailed off awkwardly. The painful pause spoke volumes, filling the room with unspoken words. Eli's jaw tightened visibly as Maggie watched realization dawn on his face like a cold winter sunrise. The whole town, even kind-hearted Sammy really did think he was dying, had been preparing for his departure while he'd been hiding from life itself. Sammy shuffled his feet, the grocery bags crinkling in his nervous hands. I'll just put these in the kitchen, he mumbled, backing away from the heavy silence that filled the room like a physical presence. His eyes darted between Eli's thunderous expression and Maggie's calm determination before he retreated down the hallway. After his truck's engine sputtered to life and the sound of tires crunching on gravel faded into the distance, Eli paced the study like a caged bear. His weathered hands opened and closed at his sides, fingertips drumming against his worn jeans with each turn. See what you've stirred up? He growled, gesturing toward the window where dust still hung in the air from Sammy's departure. 20 years of peace. Now the whole mountain will be tramping up here with their casseroles and condolences. Next thing you know, they'll be organizing prayer circles on my front porch. We could fix this easily, Maggie said, settling into the worn armchair as if she belonged there. The leather creaked beneath her as she smoothed her hands over the arms, worn shiny from years of use. One trip to town, a few conversations, clear things up before rumors take root. Absolutely not. Eli's voice was firm as oak, his spine straightening as if bracing against an invisible wind. I don't go down there. Period. Haven't in 2 decades, and I'm not starting now. Then let me stay the week. Maggie leaned forward, her eyes bright with purpose, crow's feet deepening at their corners. Her voice softened but gained intensity. That's all I'm asking. 7 days, and I'll never bother you again. 7 days to help sort things out. Eli stopped pacing, planting his feet firmly on the braided rug. He studied her face for tricks, for hidden agendas, his gaze narrow and suspicious. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the seconds of their standoff. And then you'll leave? He asked finally, doubt hanging on every word. Scout's honor? She held up 3 fingers, a small smile warming her face. But you have to let me help properly. Cooking, cleaning, basic chores. No sense in both of us being here if I'm just taking up space. Fine. He crossed his arms over his chest, the flannel of his shirt pulling tight across broad shoulders. But no more snooping, no questions about the past, no trying to fix what isn't broken. My life works just fine the way it is. Deal. Maggie stood and extended her hand across the space between them. Eli looked at it for a long moment, as if it might bite, before giving it one quick, dry shake and dropping it like it burned. They spent the morning working side by side, the silence broken only by Maggie's occasional humming as they repaired loose boards on old Mr. Johnson's chicken coop. The sun climbed higher, warming the back of Eli's neck as he measured and cut replacement slats with practiced precision. The neighbor had wandered over just after breakfast, wringing his gnarled hands, his thinning white hair catching the breeze. His concerned eyes kept darting toward Eli's cabin. Heard about your situation, Eli, Mr. Johnson said, his voice wavering like a radio stuck between stations. If you need anything at all, Martha's made extra stew, and I could help with firewood come evening. Eli's shoulders tensed visibly as he hammered a nail with unnecessary force, driving it deep into the wood with a single, angry stroke. Maggie watched him retreat into himself, like a turtle pulling into its shell, his expression closing off completely. He's managing just fine, she assured Mr. Johnson, gently steering the conversation toward his prized hens and their recent egg production. Her hand briefly touched Eli's arm, a fleeting connection he neither acknowledged nor rebuffed. Throughout the day, 3 more neighbors found excuses to stop by. Mrs. Henderson brought apple pie still warm from the oven. The Peterson twins needed to borrow a tool they'd never before required. Each time, Eli grew quieter, his responses becoming single words or grunts, his body language increasingly rigid. By sunset, the strain showed in the deep lines around his mouth and the tight set of his jaw. Over a simple supper of cornbread and bean soup, steam rising between them like the questions neither would speak, Maggie finally broke their unspoken agreement. She set down her spoon with a gentle clink against the worn ceramic bowl. "Why didn't you ever tell them the truth?" she asked softly, her eyes steady on his face. "All these years they've believed whatever they believed, and you never corrected them." Eli pushed his spoon through the soup, making aimless patterns in the broth, watching beans and carrots drift in his wake. The kitchen light cast deep shadows across the hollows of his face. "Silence is easier than truth," he said at last, each word seeming to cost him something precious. "Always has been." After helping with the dishes, Eli washing while Maggie dried, their routine already settling into something familiar, Maggie went to hang her damp coat in the workshop attached to the side of the cabin. The space smelled of sawdust and varnish, a perfume of patience and creation. Tools hung arranged with military precision on pegboard walls, each implement perfectly aligned, waiting for skilled hands. A sheet-covered shape in the corner caught her eye. Something about its dimensions, its careful placement away from sawdust and traffic, spoke of importance. She hesitated, remembering her promise not to pry before curiosity won out. She lifted one corner of the cloth and froze. There, bathed in the last rays of sunset, streaming through the dusty windows, stood a half-finished cradle frame. The wood was honey-colored pine, glowing amber in the fading light, each curve carved with loving detail that spoke of hours of careful attention. Decorative vines twined around the rockers like living things, leaving space for more designs yet to be added. One end bore the beginnings of what might become flowers or stars. Maggie let the sheet fall back, her heart aching with questions she'd promised not to ask. She backed away silently, leaving the cradle to its secrets and the man to his silence, wondering what pain lay buried beneath 20 years of solitude and careful craftsmanship. Maggie's fingers traced the edge of the sheet, feeling the softness worn by years of careful handling. "It's beautiful work," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper in the dust-moated workshop. The craftsmanship is exquisite." Eli's jaw tightened visibly as he moved to his workbench, his weathered hands finding their familiar places among his tools. "Shouldn't have been snooping," he muttered, the words clipped and defensive. "I wasn't. The sheet slipped when I walked past," she explained, watching as he arranged his tools with methodical precision, each chisel and plane returning to its designated spot. The care he took spoke of decades of habit. Would you teach me something about woodworking? Just basic stuff? I've always wanted to learn." After a long pause that stretched between them like a physical thing, Eli picked up a piece of sandpaper, the rough surface catching on his calloused fingertips. "Here, simple enough to start with." He demonstrated the motion, his hand moving in smooth, practiced strokes following the grain of the wood. Always with the wood, never against it. Let the material guide you. Maggie copied his movements on a spare piece of pine, feeling the soft resistance beneath her fingers. As she worked, her attention caught on something unexpected. Her fingers brushed against faint lettering carved with loving precision into the side. LM. She felt Eli go still beside her, his breathing suddenly shallow. "Like this?" she asked quickly, deliberately focusing on her sanding, giving him space to collect himself. His voice was gruff, rougher than before. "Bit lighter. You're not trying to wear it down to nothing. Just smoothing the surface, see? Gentle but firm." They worked in companionable silence, the soft scratch of sandpaper filling the workshop like a meditation. Sunlight slanted through the dusty windows, catching motes that danced in the air around them. The tension gradually eased from Eli's shoulders, his movements becoming more fluid as the minutes passed. "I need new shoes," Maggie said eventually, gesturing to her still damp loafers that squeaked slightly with every step. "Maybe we could drive into town tomorrow, get some supplies. I could use some groceries too." Eli's hands stilled immediately, hovering above the wood. "I don't," he began, his voice catching. "It's just a quick trip. In and out," she reassured him, her voice gentle but persistent. She smiled, crinkling the corners of her eyes. "Besides, I'm a terrible driver on mountain roads. I'd probably end up in a ditch somewhere, and then you'd have to come rescue me anyway." 20 years, he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her, but finally nodded reluctantly. His fingers tapped an anxious rhythm against the workbench. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with mist rising from the valleys below the cabin. Maggie watched Eli's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel as they descended the mountain road, each switchback causing him to tense further. Every curve seemed to add another layer of tension to his face, deepening the lines around his mouth. The small-town square hadn't changed much in 2 decades, a snapshot frozen in time. American flags fluttered from lampposts, and window boxes overflowed with late summer flowers in brilliant reds and purples. The courthouse clock still chimed the quarter hour, its bell echoing across the square. Several people waved at Maggie as they walked past Carson's general store, their eyes curious about her companion. "Maggie," called Mrs. Peterson from the post office steps, her silver hair neatly pinned back. Her friendly smile faltered noticeably when she saw Eli, uncertainty crossing her face. "Oh, Mr. Mercer, how are you feeling? We haven't seen you in town for quite some time." Eli mumbled something indecipherable and ducked into the store, his shoulders hunching protectively. Maggie hurried after him, noting how people stopped mid-conversation to stare, their faces a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and something that looked uncomfortably like judgment. "Maggie? A word?" Ruth appeared suddenly at her elbow, dressed in her practical nursing clothes, drawing her toward the pharmacy counter with gentle insistence. "I need to explain something about the situation." Eli pretended to study canned goods nearby, but his posture betrayed his attention to their whispered conversation. "I thought he needed company," Ruth whispered urgently, her kind face troubled. "He's been alone so long up there. I never imagined people would think." She twisted her hands nervously, wedding band glinting. "The hospice program was just meant to help, but this whole situation has gotten completely out of hand." "You think?" Eli's voice carried clearly across the aisle, sharp with hurt. His face had gone blank, the carefully constructed mask he wore when neighbors visited the cabin. Without another word, he walked out of the store, the bell above the door jingling accusingly. "Poor man," old Mr. Carson said sympathetically from behind the register, shaking his head. "Such a shame about him and Lila. Beautiful girl she was. That scandal nearly tore the town apart back then." Maggie watched through the window as Eli strode toward the truck, his shoulders rigid with hurt and remembered pain. His footsteps were quick and deliberate, like a man escaping. She wanted to run after him immediately, but something told her he needed these moments alone, with whatever ghosts had been stirred up. Instead, she quickly bought her shoes, her mind spinning with questions about Lila and the weight of secrets that seemed to fill every corner of this small town, hanging in the air like the dust motes in Eli's workshop. The bell above Carson's door jangled as Maggie hurried out into the afternoon sunshine. Eli was already at the truck, yanking the driver's side door open with enough force to make the hinges creak. "Wait," she called, quickening her pace. "Let me drive back." "I'm fine." His voice was flat, controlled. "You're upset." "Not upset. Just ready to leave." He slid behind the wheel, knuckles white as he gripped it. Maggie climbed in beside him. The truck roared to life, and they pulled away from the curb. Several townspeople stood watching, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. After they passed the town limits, Maggie ventured softly, "What happened with Lila?" Eli's jaw worked. Ancient history. Sometimes ancient history needs telling. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "She died, unexpectedly. Town made up their minds about what happened, and He shrugged. "Never saw the point in correcting them." The truck wound higher into the mountains, each curve taking them further from civilization. Late afternoon sun slanted through the pines, casting long shadows across the road. Back at the cabin, Eli disappeared to check his trap lines. Maggie found herself drawn to the workshop again. The cradle frame sat exactly where they'd left it, partially covered by the dropped sheet. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, admiring the craftsmanship. Something caught her eye, a small brass plate, face down, attached to the underside of the frame. Carefully, she turned it over. 2 names were engraved in flowing script: Lila and Grace. "What are you doing?" She startled at Eli's voice. He stood in the doorway, face ashen, as he stared at the nameplate in her hands. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to pry." Eli moved like a man in a dream, sinking onto his work stool. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. She was pregnant. His voice cracked on the last word. "We were going to... but then..." He pressed his lips together. Maggie set the cradle down gently. "Grace was your daughter?" But Eli had already pushed himself up, walking stiffly to the cabin's main room. He dropped into a chair at the table, eyes fixed on the cradle frame she'd carried in behind him. The look on his face was devastating, as if he were seeing ghosts from a past he'd tried desperately to forget. The silence hung thick in the cabin's main room. Outside, a mourning dove called softly as the day's last light filtered through the windows. "It was raining that night too," Eli said finally, his voice rough. "Not like when you came, worse, the kind of storm that makes you think the world's ending." Maggie sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. "Lila showed up at my door, soaked through. She was 7 months along." He swallowed hard. "Said she needed me to promise her something. Made me swear I'd finish the cradle no matter what." His fingers traced patterns on the wooden table. "The pain started an hour later. Roads were washed out. By the time help came..." He shook his head. "Last thing she said was, 'Promise me.' So I did." Thunder rumbled in the distance, an echo of that long-ago night. Maggie watched emotions play across Eli's weathered face. "Maybe," she said softly. "Finishing it would be a way to honor her. And that promise." Eli stared at the cradle frame for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Been avoiding it long enough, I suppose." They moved to the workshop together. Eli showed Maggie how to hold the sandpaper, guiding her hands with gentle patience. "Long strokes, following the grain," he instructed. She tried, but the paper slipped, creating an awkward scratch. "Oh, I'm sorry." To her surprise, Eli chuckled. "Reminds me of my first attempt. Made a mess of my grandfather's rocker." As the afternoon deepened into evening, they worked side by side. Maggie's clumsy attempts with the tools brought unexpected moments of laughter. Eli's skilled hands shaped pieces that would join the frame, his movements sure and practiced. The oil lamp cast a warm glow over their work, and the silence between them grew comfortable. Later, over bowls of soup, Maggie pulled a small book from her bag. "Mind if I read something?" Eli gestured for her to continue, seeming more at ease than she'd yet seen him. "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul." She read Emily Dickinson's words softly, watching as Eli's features softened. The hint of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. The evening wrapped around them like a gentle blanket. As Maggie gathered their dishes, Eli remained at the table, fingers still tracing the cradle's smooth wood. "I never got to meet the child," he whispered, then stood abruptly and disappeared into his bedroom, leaving Maggie with her unasked questions hanging in the darkness. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin windows as Maggie stirred oatmeal on the stove, watching the thick mixture bubble and form tiny craters. She'd barely slept, her mind turning over Eli's whispered confession from the night before, replaying his words until they were worn smooth like river stones in her thoughts. The sound of his bedroom door creaking open made her straighten her shoulders with determination, taking a deep breath as she steadied herself for the conversation ahead. "Sleep well?" she asked, setting a steaming bowl in front of him, the aroma of cinnamon and brown sugar rising between them like a gentle offering. Eli grunted, reaching for the coffee pot with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. His eyes were rimmed with shadows that suggested his night had been as restless as hers, the weight of decades pressing down on him in the darkness. "Eli," she began carefully, stirring her own oatmeal without taking a bite. "Did the baby survive?" The spoon stopped halfway to his mouth, suspended in mid-air like a pendulum frozen in time. For a long moment, he stared into his oatmeal, as if reading answers in the swirls of brown sugar, his weathered face a mask of memories and regrets. "Yes," he said finally, the word escaping like something precious and fragile. "A healthy girl. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Lila got to hold her once." Maggie sat down across from him, her own breakfast forgotten, hands folded together on the table. "What happened?" she asked, her voice gentle but persistent. "Town was different back then. Reputations mattered more than people." He pushed his bowl away with rough fingers, as if pushing away the past itself. "Lila's family arranged everything. The baby went to a good home, folks who couldn't have children of their own. Everyone agreed it was best to keep things quiet, to let her grow up without the whispers following her." "And you never tried to find her?" Maggie asked, leaning forward slightly. "Thought about it every day for 30 years. His voice roughened like sandpaper against wood. "Started 100 letters I never sent. Drove by the county records office at least a dozen times but couldn't make myself go in. But secrets protect people. Learning the truth now might hurt more than help." Maggie watched him rise and head to the workshop, his shoulders heavy with the weight of decades, each step deliberate as if walking through deep water. She followed him, standing in the doorway, watching as he picked up his tools and began working on the cradle's delicate spindles, his hands finding purpose in the familiar motions. "The truth has waited long enough," she said softly, dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight between them. "Don't you think your daughter deserves to know who she is, where she came from, who loved her enough to let her go?" Eli's hands stilled on the wood, fingers pressing into the grain as if seeking an anchor. "Leave it be, Maggie. Some wounds don't need reopening." The morning passed in focused work, broken only by the sound of sanding and the quiet tap of hammer on wood. The rhythm of creation filled the small workshop with purpose, each piece of the cradle coming together under Eli's careful hands. Around noon, the familiar rumble of Sammy's truck approached, tires crunching on the gravel driveway. The young man bounded up the porch steps with his usual energy, the screen door slapping behind him as he entered, bringing the scent of pine and fresh air. "Morning, folks. Beautiful day out there," he announced, setting down a cardboard box on the counter. "Brought your usual supplies, plus some extra coffee. That dark roast you like, Mr. Mercer. Thought you might need it." He glanced between them, sensing the lingering tension. "Say, there's a community meeting tomorrow at the church. Nothing fancy, just coffee and Pastor Dave's famous cinnamon rolls. Folks were hoping you both might come." "What for?" Eli's tone held warning, sharp edges cutting through the air between them. Sammy shifted uncomfortably, his eager smile faltering as he scuffed the toe of his boot against the floorboard. "Well, people want to honor you, Mr. Mercer. You know, before—" He trailed off, face reddening, hands fidgeting with his cap. "They want to thank you for all you've done over the years." "Before I die?" Eli's voice cracked like a whip. "This is your doing," he rounded on Maggie, eyes flashing with anger born of fear. "Coming here, stirring things up, telling the whole town my business. Now the whole town thinks they need to say goodbye, to make themselves feel better about the dying old man on the mountain." "Eli," Maggie started, standing her ground. "No, I've managed fine for 30 years without anyone's help or pity. I don't need a farewell party or people pretending they cared all along." Sammy backed toward the door, his young face etched with distress. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. Folks just care, that's all." "It's not your fault, Sammy," Maggie said firmly, standing her ground as Eli paced the small kitchen like a caged animal. "And it's not mine either, Eli Mercer. You've been hiding from the truth so long you've forgotten how to face it. These people aren't your enemies." The door closed softly behind Sammy as he made his escape, leaving a vacuum of silence in his wake. Eli and Maggie stood in tense silence, the unfinished cradle between them like a reminder of all that remained unsaid, its curved edges catching the midday light. Hours passed, marked only by the sound of tools against wood and the occasional sigh. The sun was setting, painting the workshop in amber and gold, when Eli finally spoke again. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words hanging in the sawdust-filled air. "You didn't deserve that." Maggie looked up from where she'd been carefully sanding a small piece of wood, her fingers tracing the grain. "No, I didn't. The meeting tomorrow is a perfect chance to set things right," she finished, setting aside her sandpaper. "These people care about you, Eli. They deserve the truth, and so does your daughter. Some secrets protect, but others just slowly poison everything around them." He picked up the last carved piece of the cradle, a delicate heart that would join the headboard to the frame, polished to a soft glow. His fingers traced the pattern he'd designed so long ago, following the swirls and curves that had lived in his imagination for decades. "I'm scared," he admitted, the words barely audible in the quiet room, his vulnerability laid bare like freshly cut wood. "I know." Maggie stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his, offering silent strength. "But you won't be alone. Not anymore." Together they fitted the final pieces into place, their hands working in perfect rhythm as if they'd been building together for years. The cradle stood complete in the fading light, its smooth lines catching the last light of day. 30 years of waiting, of silence, of guilt and grief, all carved into something beautiful that could finally serve its purpose. "Tomorrow then," Eli said softly, his hand resting on the cradle's curved edge, a promise in his voice that hadn't been there before. The afternoon sun beat down as Eli carefully wrapped the cradle in an old quilt, his movements slow and deliberate. Maggie watched from the cabin's porch, noting how his hands trembled slightly. "We can put it in the back of the truck," she offered, stepping forward to help. "No." Eli shook his head. "It rides up front with us. Protected." The drive into town felt longer than usual. Every bump in the dirt road made Eli wince, his eyes darting to check on the wrapped cradle between them. Maggie kept quiet, understanding his nervousness. The church parking lot was already full when they arrived. Eli sat with the engine idling, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "They're just neighbors," Maggie reminded him gently. "Neighbors with long memories," he muttered, but opened his door anyway. Together they carried the cradle up the church steps. The murmuring inside grew louder as they entered. Familiar faces turned to stare. Mrs. Peterson from the general store, old Tom who delivered mail, faces that had watched and wondered about Eli for decades. "Poor man," someone whispered, "bringing his memories to share before—" "Always knew there was more to that scandal," another voice hissed. Mayor Williams stood at the pulpit, his round face beaming with false cheer. "Friends, we've gathered today to honor our neighbor, Eli Mercer, who has chosen to spend his remaining time—" "Wait," Eli interrupted, stepping forward, I need to explain." "Explain?" A sharp voice cut through the crowd. Mrs. Adelaide Tate, her steel-gray hair pulled tight in a bun, rose from her seat. "Like you explained abandoning poor Lila Morrison when she needed you most?" The room went deadly quiet. Eli's face drained of color. "I never—" he started. "I was there," Mrs. Tate continued, her voice rising. "That terrible night when Lila's father came looking for you. But you'd already run away to your mountain, hadn't you?" Before Eli could respond, George Patterson, the retired courthouse clerk, stood up waving a yellowed paper. "I found this in the old records. Custody dispute, filed 30 years ago. Your name's all over it, Mercer." Maggie turned to Eli, her eyes wide with confusion and hurt. "You said you never pursued them," she whispered, "that you stayed away to protect everyone." The room erupted in overlapping voices. "Always knew there was something wrong about him. Poor Lila. The baby. Hiding up there all these years." Eli stood frozen, the cradle still half wrapped in his arms. The carefully carved wood seemed to mock him now, 3 decades of silence carved into every line. Maggie waited, hoping he would defend himself, explain, say anything. But Eli said nothing. The disappointment on Maggie's face cut deeper than any accusation. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the sudden hush that fell over the church. The cradle sat abandoned on a front pew, its quilt wrapping trailing like a shroud. The drive back to the cabin felt endless. Eli's truck crawled up the mountain road, each mile heavier than the last. The abandoned cradle sat accusingly in the passenger seat where Maggie should have been. Inside his cabin, the silence pressed in. He lit the oil lamp with shaking hands and pulled out the drawer he'd avoided for so long. The blue ribbon came undone easily, releasing decades of unsent letters. Settling at his workbench, Eli began carving a small wooden box as he read through the yellowed pages. "Dear Lila," his younger self had written, "another spring has come to the mountain. The wildflowers you loved are blooming again." The memory swept over him like a wave. Lila in his workshop, her face tear-stained but determined. "Please, Eli, you're the only one I can trust with this." She'd told him everything that night, about Thomas Reynolds, the married bank president, about their brief affair, about the baby growing inside her. "If people know who the father is, this child will carry that shame forever," she'd pleaded. "I can't do that to an innocent baby." Eli's knife slipped, cutting into the wood grain wrong. He barely noticed. "I'll protect you both," he'd promised her, "whatever it takes." But then came the storm, the complicated birth, Lila's fever rising. Her last words still haunted him. "Keep your promise, Eli. Keep the secret safe." He'd honored that promise through decades of whispers and judgment, letting the town believe whatever they wanted about his role in the scandal. Better they think him a coward than know the truth that would hurt the child. The box took shape under his hands as the night deepened. Simple, sturdy, meant to hold letters that had waited too long to be read. Dawn was breaking when a soft knock came at the door. Maggie stood there, her eyes red-rimmed but gentle. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. Eli stepped back to let her in. The box sat finished on his workbench, the letters spread around it. "I made a promise," he said quietly. "To Lila, the night before she died." Maggie sat at the table, waiting. Slowly, carefully, Eli told her everything, about Thomas Reynolds and the affair, about Lila's desperate need to protect her unborn child from scandal, about the promise that had shaped 30 years of silence. "The custody paper they found, that was Thomas trying to claim the baby later. I helped hide them. Lila's aunt took them to Arizona. I never knew more than that. It was safer that way." "You carried all this alone," Maggie said softly. Let everyone think the worst of you, rather than break your word. A promise is all we really have in the end, Eli replied. I couldn't give Lila much, but I could give her that. Maggie reached across the table and took his weathered hand in hers. You've honored that promise, but maybe it's time for truth now. That child, that adult, deserves to know about their mother's courage. And yours. Eli stared at their joined hands. Running from truth has cost enough already, he said finally, but I wouldn't know where to start. The church records, Maggie said firmly. Birth certificates, baptisms, there will be traces. We can start there. Eli nodded slowly, gathering the letters into the newly carved box. Tomorrow then. We'll go tomorrow. The church basement smelled of old paper and dust. Morning light filtered through narrow windows, casting thin beams across rows of filing cabinets and shelves loaded with leather-bound records. Eli's fingers trembled as he opened the first baptismal registry. Start with 1975, Maggie suggested softly, pulling up a wooden chair beside him. That would be the year. Pages rustled as they worked in silence. Eli's eyes blurred over countless names and dates, each one a thread in the tapestry of local history. After an hour, his neck ached from bending over the books. Wait, Maggie said suddenly. Look at this entry. Before they could read further, a gentle cough interrupted them. Sister Martha, the elderly former midwife who'd served the community for 40 years, stood in the doorway. I thought I might find you here, she said, her lined face kind. I remember that night, you know. The storm was terrible. Eli's hands gripped the edge of the table. You were there? I delivered many babies in those days, Sister Martha said, settling into a chair across from them. But I never forgot Lila's little girl. Such a fighter, just like her mama. She paused, considering. The Hendersons took her. Good people from over in Pine Valley. They named her Grace. The name hit Eli like a physical blow. Grace. Lila's daughter had a name. At the registrar's office, they traced a paper trail through decades. School records, a marriage license, a change of address. Grace Henderson became Grace Johnson, living in Millbrook, just 2 towns over. 45 minutes away, Maggie said quietly as they sat in Eli's truck. All these years, she's been 45 minutes away. Eli stared at the steering wheel, his knuckles white. What if she doesn't want to know? Every child deserves to know they were loved, Maggie replied, that their mother was brave and beautiful, that someone kept faith with her memory all these years. The drive to Millbrook passed in tense silence. They found the house easily, a neat white craftsman with purple flowers in window boxes. Eli sat in the truck for a long time, clutching an envelope containing the letter he'd written that morning. I'll wait here, Maggie said gently. Eli's boots seemed impossibly heavy as he walked up the path. He placed the envelope carefully in the mailbox, raising the little red flag with trembling fingers. Back in the truck, they waited. Minutes crawled by like hours. Then the front door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch, dark hair like Lila's, same graceful way of moving. Grace Johnson stood very still, reading the letter Eli had written. Even from this distance, they could see her hands shaking. Eli held his breath, watching his past and future collide in this moment, as Grace looked up from the letter and toward the truck where they waited. Grace's hand trembled as she gestured toward the front door. Please, come in. Eli's legs felt like lead as he and Maggie made their way up the porch steps. Inside, the living room was warm and inviting, filled with family photos and comfortable furniture, but the atmosphere crackled with tension. I've spent years wondering, Grace said, her voice tight. She stood by the fireplace, still holding the letter. "Why did you disappear? Why all the secrets?" Her eyes, so much like Lila's, searched Eli's face for answers. Eli sank into an armchair, his shoulders heavy with decades of unspoken truth. "Your mother." His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew." As sunset light streamed through lace curtains, Eli shared everything. The storm that terrible night, Lila's desperate plea to protect her baby from scandal, the promise he made to a dying woman he loved. Maggie sat quietly nearby, her steady presence giving him strength. "She knew the truth would hurt too many people," Eli explained, his voice rough with emotion. "She wanted you to have a chance at a life without whispers following you, without judgment." Grace listened intently, tears gathering in her eyes. When Eli finished, Maggie reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. "These belong to your mother," she said softly, handling the bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. "And this," she placed a photograph of the half-finished cradle on the coffee table. Grace's hands shook as she opened the first letter. "My dearest baby," she read aloud, then stopped, overcome. Tears fell onto the yellowed paper as she read silently, learning her mother's heart through words written decades ago. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the gentle ticking of a wall clock and Grace's quiet sniffles. Finally, she looked up at Eli, her eyes full of understanding rather than anger. "You kept your promise?" she whispered. "All these years you carried this alone to protect me." She wiped her eyes. "Thank you for honoring her wish, for protecting her dignity, and mine." Eli's chest tightened with emotion he couldn't express. Grace stood and walked to a shelf filled with family photos. "I'd like to display the cradle," she said softly, "with her full name on it. Lila deserves to be remembered." "Yes," Eli managed, his voice thick. "She does." Grace turned back to him, tears still gleaming on her cheeks. Without warning, she crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. Eli stiffened in surprise, then slowly returned the embrace as the setting sun painted the room in shades of gold. In that moment of connection, he felt the weight of his decades-long promise finally lift. Through the window, the last rays of sunlight touched Grace's dark hair, so like her mother's, and Eli knew that at last, his faithful silence had served its purpose. The drive home from Grace's house was peaceful, filled with comfortable silence. Streetlights flickered on as dusk settled, and Eli felt lighter than he had in decades. Beside him, Maggie hummed softly to herself, a gentle smile on her face. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Eli found himself adjusting his tie in the mirror, something he hadn't done in years. When Maggie knocked on his door, she was wearing a simple blue dress. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes twinkling. The community center buzzed with activity when they arrived. The cradle stood on a wooden pedestal, its surface gleaming with fresh polish. The mayor, looking slightly embarrassed, cleared his throat as people gathered around. "Folks," he began, "we owe Mr. Mercer here an apology. We jumped to conclusions without knowing the full story. Eli wasn't dying. He was keeping a promise, protecting a mother and child when they needed it most." Murmurs of understanding rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Peterson, who had been one of the loudest gossips, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Eli," she said, patting his arm. "We should have known better. You've always been a man of honor." One by one, townspeople came forward with kind words and apologies. Ruth, the nurse who had started it all, gave Eli a warm hug. "I only wanted to help," she whispered. "I never meant to cause such a stir." "You did help," Eli replied gruffly. "Just not the way you thought." The mayor unveiled the brass plaque mounted beside the cradle. It read, "In loving memory of Lila Matthews, and in honor of her daughter Grace, a mother's love knows no bounds." Grace, who had driven in for the ceremony, traced the letters with her fingers. "It's perfect," she said softly. As the afternoon wore on, people shared stories and refreshments. The atmosphere was warm and healing, like a family finally reunited after a long separation. Later that evening, back at the cabin, Eli and Maggie sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. The air was sweet with pine and late summer flowers. "Hard to believe it's only been a week," Eli mused, running his hand along the porch railing. Maggie nodded, sipping her tea. "Amazing how much can change in 7 days." "I never thought—" Eli paused, collecting his thoughts. "I never thought telling the truth would feel like this, like coming home." "Sometimes we carry burdens so long we forget we can set them down," Maggie replied. Eli turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Thank you, Maggie, for not giving up on me, for seeing past my stubbornness." She smiled warmly. "That's what friends are for." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the chorus of crickets and the distant call of a whippoorwill. "You know," Maggie said finally, "my official wife for a week assignment ends tomorrow." The words hung in the evening air, accompanied by the gentle creak of rocking chairs and the soft whisper of wind through the pines. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows as Maggie methodically folded her clothes and tucked them into her overnight bag. The familiar aroma of coffee filled the small space, and she could hear Eli in the kitchen, the clink of cups and spoons more deliberate than usual, as if he was trying to make each moment last longer. "Coffee's ready?" he called out, his voice gruff but gentle. Maggie zipped her bag and joined him at the worn kitchen table. Steam rose from 2 ceramic mugs, dancing in the early light. Eli had set out bread and jam, a simple breakfast that somehow felt special. "You know," Maggie said, spreading raspberry preserves on her toast, "it's funny how much can change in just 1 week." Eli nodded, staring into his coffee. "This old cabin hasn't seen so much activity in decades." "Or so much truth-telling," Maggie added softly. "Truth's like a river," Eli mused, surprising himself with the metaphor. "Once it starts flowing, it finds its way." They ate in a comfortable silence for a while, the morning birds providing a gentle soundtrack through the open window. Maggie noticed how Eli seemed different now, his shoulders more relaxed, his eyes clearer. "You know," she ventured, "just because the official assignment is over doesn't mean I'll disappear. Friends check on each other." Eli cleared his throat. "I'd like that," he said quietly. Then, as if remembering something important, he stood up and walked to his bedroom. He returned carrying a small wooden box, expertly carved with intricate leaf patterns. "Made this the other night," he said, placing it in front of her, "when everything felt dark." Maggie lifted the lid carefully. Inside lay a folded piece of paper. She opened it, recognizing Eli's careful handwriting. "Dear Maggie, you brought light back into these old rooms. Thank you for seeing past my walls and helping me remember what it means to live again. Eli." Maggie blinked rapidly, touching the corner of her eye with her napkin. "Oh, Eli," she whispered. "It's not much," he said, looking embarrassed. "It's everything," she corrected him, running her fingers over the carved patterns. The morning slipped away too quickly. Soon Maggie's bags were loaded in her car, and they stood awkwardly on the porch, neither quite ready for goodbye. "Well," she said finally, "I'd better get going before I think of another reason to stay." Eli nodded, hands in his pockets. "Drive safe." Maggie hugged him quickly, then walked to her car. As she pulled away, she honked twice, 2 cheerful beeps that echoed off the mountainside. Eli stood watching until her car disappeared around the bend, the sound of tires on gravel fading into the morning quiet. He stayed on the porch a moment longer, breathing in the pine-scented air. Then, with purpose in his step, he walked to his workshop. Sunlight streamed through the dusty window as he selected a piece of cedar wood and began to sketch out a design. His hands moved surely, confidently, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Eli prepared his supper, a simple meal of soup and bread. But unlike countless solitary meals before, this one felt different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. He sat at his table, surrounded by the memories of laughter and conversation from the past week, and felt truly content for the first time in years. Several months later, autumn painted the mountain in brilliant golds and reds. Eli sat in his familiar spot on the porch, a letter from Maggie in his weathered hands. The paper crinkled softly as he unfolded it, smiling at her familiar looping handwriting. Dear Eli, he read aloud to the evening air. Can you believe it's been 6 months since I showed up on your doorstep, soaked to the bone, and determined to be your wife for a week? I still laugh thinking about your face when you opened that door. He chuckled, remembering his shock and initial grumpiness. How different things were now. Every Tuesday afternoon, he taught woodworking at the community center, showing eager students how to feel the grain of wood, how to let it speak to them. Just yesterday, old Mrs. Peterson had proudly shown off her first properly sanded jewelry box. The sound of children's laughter echoed in his memory. Grace's twins had visited last weekend, climbing all over him as he sat in his workshop. Mr. Eli, they'd called, make us another bear. He'd spent hours whittling small woodland creatures while they watched with wide eyes, asking questions about their grandmother Lila. Telling those stories didn't hurt anymore. Instead, they felt like gifts he could finally share. His eyes returned to Maggie's letter. I'm bringing a new pie recipe when I visit next week. No complaints about too much cinnamon this time, though I notice you ate every slice anyway. Her bi-monthly visits had become highlights in his calendar, comfortable afternoons spent sharing coffee and conversation. Sometimes they worked together in the workshop, her skills improving slowly but surely. Other times they simply sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains while talking about everything and nothing. The town had changed, too. When he walked down Main Street now, people greeted him warmly, asked his opinion on their home repair projects, or stopped to chat about Grace's latest visit. The weight of old rumors had lifted, replaced by simple truth and acceptance. Eli reached the end of Maggie's letter. Thank you, my dear friend, for letting kindness back into your life. It turns out we both needed that stormy night more than we knew. See you next week, Maggie. Setting the letter aside, Eli began to whistle softly, an old tune Lila had loved, something about mountains and coming home. The melody drifted out across his porch and into the evening air, carrying with it memories that now brought smiles instead of shadows. He stood up, joints creaking a bit, and walked to his workshop. A chair waited there, nearly finished, its lines clean and strong. Taking up his carving tool, Eli bent down and carefully etched a small heart into the underside of the seat. It wasn't fancy, just a simple symbol of the love that had found its way back into every corner of his days. Standing back, he ran his hand over the smooth wood and smiled. Peace settled around him like a familiar blanket as the mountains turned purple in the fading light. Finally, after all these years, everything felt right. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, Make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.